Do you have a list of questions or whatever?
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Cabrera, library clerk with the Santa Ana Public Library. Today is Saturday, August 31st, 2013. It is approximately 1:48 p.m. and I'm conducting an oral history for the Santa Ana Oral History Project. Can you please state your full name?
Timothy Dennis Rush.
Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today, Tim. I know it's very hot, so try to keep cool out here in your back porch. What is your date of birth, Tim?
April the 20th, 1955. Same day as Hitler and Napoleon. Not obviously same year.
And where were you born, Tim?
I was born in Los Angeles at Good Samaritan Hospital. Almost in a cab.
Almost in a cab. Do you have any siblings?
I do. It's a little bit disjointed. I have a stepsister, Linda Collar, who lives in San Gabriel. I have a stepbrother, Robert Budahaus, who lives in, I believe it's South Dakota. I haven't seen him in 37 years. My stepsister I see fairly regularly. We're fairly close. I have several half-brothers and sisters whom I'm not particularly close to, mostly because they're much older than I. Mm-hmm. A number of them have passed away. My dad was married 3 times, and I'm the product of his second marriage, the only child. Although my mother had another son by her first husband, so that's one of my half brothers. That's Chris Wilson, who lives in Kernville. So we stay in touch only because I make a supreme effort to do it. So, anyway. So.
And what were your parents' names?
My father was Harold Freeman Rush, who was born in Benson, Arizona, but raised in Greeley, Colorado. My mother was Mary Ruth Rush, Mary Ruth Sewell. Sewell was her maiden name. And she was born in Tennessee and was raised in various parts of eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, and in Oregon, Washington, and California. My grandfather, her father, was a sawmill architect, and he emigrated here with one of his brothers via Canada. They emigrated from England, and Grandpa worked for Weyerhaeuser and Georgia Pacific, mostly building sawmills up and down the east and west coast in the early part of the last century.
And do you know how your parents met?
It's my loose understanding that they met at a cocktail party. And that would have been 53 or would have been about 52 or 3 they met. They were married in 54 and I was born in 55.
Can you speak a little bit more about your father and what he did for a living?
Well, my dad was a mechanical engineer, although he wound up in that station after a variety of other things. He was born in 1909, so by the time he was eligible to go to college, his mother and dad both died when he was very young. He had 5 paper routes. That's how he supported himself because he became an emancipated miner. He didn't get along with his Uncle Roy, who he had become a ward of when his mother and dad had passed away. His mother died as a result of the great influenza pandemic that happened in the late teen years of the last century. That was, millions of people died in North America from that. And his father died of, I think, of cancer, I believe. And he worked for Chicago Bridge and Iron, and he was some sort of an engineer. The mother, of course, was a homemaker. But my dad, because his parents were both dead, he did go to college for several years on a football scholarship, but had to drop out because he just didn't have the funds to continue. There weren't the scholarships available in those days like today. And so he began working, and somehow or another he wound up as a driver for Greyhound lines. And he worked for them for, I think, on and off for about 19 years. And he worked for them through the Depression. And he also worked as a plumber. So it was via plumbing that Dad became a mechanical engineer, because and he actually wound up as a member of the Pipe Fitters Union, but he always worked as a superintendent or as a project manager on these large construction sites for breweries and chemical plants and refineries. That was most of his work. And Dad was, because of his very mathematical mind, Dad's world, 2 plus 2 is always 4. It never varies. So his world was black and white. He told you to be home at 6 o'clock. I'd get in as much trouble for walking in at 7:30 as getting home at 6:02. So his world was black and white. He was very, very strict. And my half-brother Chris and I went to military school. I started when I was 4 and a half in Long Beach, Southern California Military Academy. And so sadly that place is gone. I went to the final dress parade in 1991, I think it was. But it's closed now. So, but anyway, Dad, I actually have my father's pocket watch that he got was given this watch June 1st, 1948. It took him 13 years of work to get a watch for 10 years of driving without an accident. This is a Hamilton Railway Special. Beautiful. It's a 21-jewel, gorgeous railroad watch. And he never wore the watch. He gave it to me on my 21st birthday. And he had it in the original presentation box and so forth. And it was the 25th watch that was given out by the company. But every time he had a day off or vacation, that counted against that 10 years. So he had to work 13 years to get a watch. That's actual 10 driving years of work. And then he subsequently worked for them another 6 years, a total of about 19 years before he quit and went into construction full-time.
Did your dad ever speak about growing up or living in the Depression? You said he worked throughout the Depression for Greyhound, so he probably didn't have it as bad as most people.
Well, let's see, the Depression happened in 1929, so my dad was 20 when the Depression happened. So I think the Depression had a lot to do with him wanting to dropping out of college. And although he never lamented about that. My dad passed away when I was 21, and my mother when I was 19. So I never had occasion to talk to Dad. There's so many questions I wished I would have asked him, but when you're young, you don't think to ask those questions. And Dad like a lot of people of that era, was not one to volunteer personal information to any great degree. I do know that he had a tough, his parents were dead, the depression happened, and he, like most people of that era, dad knew how to make do, and he was very thrifty, and he was incredibly handy at repairing anything. I mean, Dad could everything from fixing a light switch to repairing a toy to upholstering furniture. I mean, Dad knew how to do it all. I used to marvel at the time, where in the world did he ever learn to do all those different tasks? But Dad knew how to do all of that stuff, and was no big deal to him. And so, but he talked about the Depression a bit. I mean, you knew that. I remember him saying that nobody had any money, and I know that as a kid that was such an odd concept. I mean, what do you mean nobody had any money? Somebody had money. And of course, as you get older, you realize and you read and learn that, well, yeah, there was a very small percentage of the population, because there was no income tax, there was no Federal Trade Commission, there was no minimum wage. There were all kinds of things that today we take for granted that didn't exist in those days. So there were a handful of imperially wealthy people, and for whom the Depression hardly affected them. And but of course, as we know, there were millions of people for whom they went to bed hungry every night. So I remember him talking about there were times when he went to bed and all they had to eat was maybe some bread crusts and hot coffee, which doesn't sound very filling, for sure.
So thinking about that on your dad, can you speak a little bit about your mom now and what she did for a living?
Well, my mother was, Mom, in later years, and certainly at the time she died, she was working for Robinson's department store, which is long gone, J.W. Robinson's. And also she worked for Saks and Bullock's, teaching knitting. And she was quite a first-class knitter. That's almost a lost art today, but she was a knitter, and I have a few things that she made. My cousins have probably more things that she made, because most of the things she made were ladies' apparel items. I have a sweater and a scarf and I think a vest or something, but obviously treasured items. But anyway, so she was a knitter. That was a hobby and a vocation of her, an avocation and a vocation. But she was a homemaker to some degree. Mom was not, I think that if she was sitting here, Mom would not be offended if I said that being a domestic engineer was really not her favorite thing. For some women keeping hearth and home is what they live for. That was not what Mom lived for. She wanted to work, but my dad wouldn't let her. And for him, it was a matter of pride, because he thought that people would look down on him, thinking, you don't make enough money to support your wife. That was obviously not an enlightened point of view, but that was very prevalent in those days. And that we would never think that today, but that was not uncommon in those days. And so she didn't work. We had a housekeeper. My brother and I went to military school. We had a gardener. She had nothing to do. And so sadly, she took up drinking. And that was obviously not a good hobby. And it ultimately led to the demise of their marriage. And it ultimately killed my mother, because she got hit in a crosswalk walking home from a bar one night up on Santa Monica Boulevard in what is now West LA. So So anyway, I mean, I treasure the memories of my mother, but she was a very bright lady. She went to college. She got a degree in English. She was a writer for the San Francisco Herald Examiner. I forget if it was the Herald Examiner or the Chronicle, but oh my goodness. Well, there'll be an edit. But anyway, so what else can I tell you about my mother? There were several favorite dishes that, of course, like all kids, you remember that your mother made.
Mm-hmm.
She loved to cook, but again, keeping house was not the tops on her list. We had a housekeeper, so that wasn't something she needed to do. Anyway,
So thank you for that about your mom and dad. One thing you did mention about both your parents is that they passed on at a early age in your life. How was that for you, and how did you manage after their passing?
well, it causes you to grow up fast when you get a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're asked to go. You're told your mother's been killed, and you have to go to the morgue and identify her body. So I don't mean to be morbid, but anyway, you grow up fast. So I was living on my own already because I had come home intoxicated one night and my dad threw me out, which is understandable given the problems he had with my mother. He was terrified of that becoming a problem for me, so he threw me out. And given that I was just as stubborn as he was, I refused to come home after he threw me out. So anyway, I mean, we patched up our differences sometime afterwards, but that's why I was living on my own. So, and then it was a year and a half later that Dad passed away, and a year later or so that Dad passed away, and so obviously I'm envious of a lot of my friends whose parents lived for decades beyond my parents. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I've never had to deal with taking care of an elderly parent, so I guess there's a silver lining in every dark cloud, so to speak. Not that I would wish that; I would have rather taken care of them as they grew old, but such is life. So, but I think because of them passing away so early, it's one of the things that helped me develop a curiosity for history. Dad was a history buff, and he loved to read, and so I got my love of books from my dad, and my mother loved to read too, but my dad was more of a book hound than even my mom was. But they both loved to read. Dad was. She read more novels. Dad hardly ever read a novel, as I don't. He was one to read political biographies and history and so forth. So,
And where did you grow up, Tim?
well, mostly we lived in Garden Grove. And I remember riding my bicycle over to Santa Ana. Mm-hmm. I remember well climbing my neighbor's pine tree. And with a pair of binoculars, I could read the time and temperature on what we call the Time and Temperature building up on North Main, by Main Place Mall. Now, sadly, the Time and Temperature doesn't show on that building anymore. I don't know what happened there. They turned it off or something, but it worked up until 3 or 4 years ago. But I remember riding my bicycle with my pals over to the United Artists Theater on 17th Street in Bristol, to what was then called Honer Plaza. Today we call it Bristol Marketplace. But there was a theater there, a United Artists Theater, and it was there that I saw Goldfinger for the first time. And that was a big thrill. We lived in Garden Grove, and then when my parents started having difficulties, why my dad sent me back east to live with my great aunt and my grandmother back in western North Carolina, where I was for about a year and a half, and then came back out here and lived with my dad. By that time, they had gotten divorced, and for a brief time, I went to San Marino Military Academy, and also to the Baxter Nokia School, which was a private school on the estate of Lucky Baldwin, called Nokia, and that is gone now. Sadly, the city of Arcadia didn't think it was worthwhile to save that property, for whom Lucky Baldwin founded the city of Arcadia. And but anyway, that's old history. But I threw myself into that battle trying to fight City Hall on that one, but didn't win that one either. So.
Now, you mentioned a little bit briefly about going to Honer Plaza and going to the movie theaters. What else was life for you growing up in your neighborhood in Garden Grove and various other places you lived?
Well, I well remember playing in the orange groves. Us kids would always play in the orange groves that, of course, in those days were all over Orange County. We lived across the street from a gigantic orange grove where what is today Santiago High School was built. I remember watching them tear out the orange grove to build the high school. I remember watching them. I used to play in orange groves that were in the area that is now the Garden Grove Freeway, and I well remember playing in those orange groves, and then all of a sudden seeing here comes the bulldozers and they tear out the orange grove. So it was, it was not atypical of that period of time. Like most kids in those days, you would get up at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning in the summers, and you would leave the house, and you'd never come back home until the street lights came on. And that was very common. My buddies and I, we had built a clubhouse at the back of one of my pals' his parents' home. They had a third of an acre, huge lot, and we had a clubhouse back there that we built. Oh my God, we would spend endless hours there playing and so forth. Lots of fun. And I remember we used to get into the tunnels, the drainage flood control channels that were right behind our houses. Of course, if there had ever been a flash flood, we would all have been deader than a doornail. But we used to crawl all around those tunnels, all over town, all over Garden Grove. And I thought about that many times. I thought, oh my God, it was so foolish. If our parents would have ever known what we were doing, they'd have skinned us alive.
What other hobbies did you have as a kid, Tim?
Oh gosh, we didn't have Little League when I grew up, or where I grew up. We didn't have Little League, so you played sports games with the kids that were on your block. Now I was at military school for a good portion of the time, and that was much more structured. And it was kind of hard to have hobbies at military school. You know, your day was pretty structured. Um, you know, you got up, you know, you had breakfast, you got dressed, you know, you went to your classes. When you were done, um, you had to do homework, you had reading you had to do. Remember on Sundays, uh, we were actually forced to you had to write letters home every week, and they did that to train you to write. You know, everybody had their own stationery, and you had to write letters home. You had to write letters, you had to write thank you notes, and of course that was good training because I, throughout my whole life, people that know me often kid me about that I'm almost compulsive about writing thank you notes to people. So even in this day and age of computers and tweeting and texting and email, I still believe mostly in the handwritten note. I think it carries a lot of weight.
So too.
But I love to, when I was a kid, I collected maps. I remember one time seeing an ad on TV for it was a subdivision up in the mountains, and I'm trying to remember the name, Pacific Pines or something like that. And so they had this fellow on the TV who said, "Oh, if you just call this number, we'll send out a packet of information with maps, details." I said, "Oh, maps! Oh, I got to get one of those." Well, I didn't realize, of course, they were promoting the sale of raw land to people. So I called the number, gave my name and number. Well, next thing you know, why, here a salesman shows up at the house, and he asks for me. My dad answers the door, and he says, "Can I help you?" And he says, I want to talk to Tim Rush. And he says, "Tim Rush?" And of course he doesn't know this, but he says, "Why do you want to talk to Tim Rush?" And he says, "Well, I'm with the Pacific Pines Real Estate Development Company, and he's inquired about our development, and we'd like to present him with this information." And Dad said, "Oh, really?" He says, "Well, let me go get him out of the sandbox." He said, "He'll be right here with you." So he brought me up, and of course the guy was pretty embarrassed when he realized that I was like 11 years old. So, but anyway, I love to collect maps. Over the years, that has grown to collecting all kinds of things. Lead soldiers, table lighters, walking sticks, cufflinks, any number of things. So, but like most kids, you know, I was into collecting stamps. I collected baseball cards for a while, coins. I collected coins for a long time. So, you know, the pretty typical things that a lot of kids get into.
Can you name the school, the military school that you went to, and you were there from what grade to what grade?
Well, the military school was Southern California Military Academy, SCMA. And it was part of the Brown schools, as in Brown University, which is back east. They also operated a school in, I think it was Glendale, which is now closed, it's gone. And they had one in San Diego, which was then called San Diego Military Academy. And I think today that school exists, but it's under a different name, because a work colleague sent his son there for a time. But of course, military schools have gone out of vogue. There is still one here that goes by the same initials, SCMA, in Anaheim, St. Catherine's Military Academy, although that was because it was operated by the Catholic Order. It was not connected to our school, which was Christian, not Catholic. Anyway, I was there, I would have been there from 1959 through about 1964. And then I was at San Marino Military Academy in, I think it was 66 or 7, somewhere in there. I was only there for a brief time. So, but it was a great experience. You know, we were taught deportment and manners, and we were, of course, admonished to address our elders as Mr. or Mrs., which of course is almost unheard of today in our children, and to say yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes please, no thank you. I was somewhere recently and I met a lady and I said, I was answering a question for her and I said, yes ma'am, and she said, don't call me ma'am. And I said, well ma'am, that's the way I was raised. She said, don't call me ma'am. And I said, ma'am, it's just habit. I can't not say it. Ma'am. It was driving her crazy.
Oh, God. Just it's a funny and brief background about my family. 2 of my older brothers went to St. Catherine's Military School.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did they like it?
One of them did. The other one did not so much.
It's one of those things that kids don't like when they're going there, but years later they grow to appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something that you look back on at the time, because all that discipline, especially even today, even more so today, is almost unheard of, and it develops lifelong traits which have great value, and are in many cases almost. They're missing in a good deal of society, sadly.
What high school did you attend?
Went to Bellflower High School all 4 years.
And how did you like Bellflower?
Well, I was very active. I was co-captain of the wrestling team. I was vice president of my senior class. I was secretary of the Interact Club. I was very active in a lot of things. I was involved in student government and lots of things. I had a great group of friends, many of them that I'm still friends with today. High school for me was a really fun experience. I know for some people maybe it wasn't, but it was a great time. And I had a lot of fond memories of that time. When we moved to Bellflower, it was after we had moved a number of times because Dad kept getting transferred to different places for his work.
Mm-hmm.
And when we moved to Bellflower, I begged my father, I said, please, let's not move somewhere again. Please don't move. That was my one request. If you don't do anything ever for me, don't buy me a gift, don't buy me anything, just don't move again. I was so tired of leaving my friends behind. And, and of course, the beauty is that it did make me, it forces you to learn how to meet people. So again, every negative comes with a positive, but and that's something that stood me in good stead as a salesperson my whole life. But by the same token, I was desperate to attend one high school for all 4 years. So my dad complied with that wish, and we stayed in Bellflower. So we moved there actually because of the quality of the public school system, which was very highly regarded. That isn't so much so today in Bellflower, but it was true then. And although having said that, because I had come from military school, I was a bit of an oddball when I first came to the public school system, because I was used to addressing my teachers as sir and madam. And of course, that's not, even in those days, that was not what was the norm for kids in school. So I put up with a bit of ridicule when I first entered the public school system. Of course, every day I came to school with a pressed shirt and cuffed pants. I didn't even own any Levi's. Mm-hmm. My dad wouldn't buy them. I finally convinced him to let me buy them when I got into the 9th or 10th grade, but initially he wouldn't let me wear Levi's, so I wore these they were khaki pants like we had in military school, and I wore wingtips. And every single night I had to shine them. That was a requirement of my dad. And every week I got my hair cut. Every single week. So for most kids, they were not getting their hair cut every week. So that was a little severe, but obviously it didn't kill me. So.
And what were your immediate plans following high school? What year did you graduate, and what were your immediate plans afterwards?
Well, I graduated in 1973, and I only very narrowly missed being called up for the draft. Of course, I registered, but they wound up not calling because the Vietnam War was winding down, so we didn't get almost nobody. I don't think anybody that I went to high school with was drafted who graduated with me. And I had been accepted to UCLA and to Cal State Long Beach. But you recall me telling about how that I got thrown out for coming home intoxicated one evening. Right, it was right after I graduated from high school, and I got thrown out. And so here I was going to go to UCLA or to Cal State Long Beach, and so I wound up going to neither school. I did wind up attending several semesters a couple of years later to Cal State Long Beach, but I wound up not going to college other than going to community college. I went to Long Beach City College and Cerritos Junior College for several years, and it wound up never graduating. I did attend a couple of semesters at Cal State Long Beach, but I never graduated, and that was something which I have always regretted. I got over it a few years ago, but I regretted it for many years. But I didn't know the first thing about scholarships or any of that, and really had nobody to guide me. And so, I obviously could have gone. Here I would have been accepted. All I had to do was apply. There were scholarships available. I had good grades in high school, and I graduated about 41st or 2nd in my class out of a class of about 340 students. So I wasn't valedictorian, but I wasn't an idiot either. So, but anyway, so that's what I did. Well, right before I'd gotten thrown out and after I graduated, my dad had gotten me a job as a laborer at Union Oil Company, and I was working for the union. It was a union job. So Dad knew, because he had connections, he took me down to the union hall. I got joined up, and so I got sent out on a job and working, and it was very hard work. I had worked through high school. I had odd jobs, and then during about half of my junior year and all of my senior year, I worked for a large restaurant in town. It would have been kind of like sort of like a claim jumper or something today, and it was not a super fancy restaurant, but it was a nicer dinner house. And anyway, I worked there as a busboy and so forth. Made pretty good money. But anyway, going to work as a union laborer, I always tell people that was one of those jobs where you start at the bottom and work down. So I worked there at Union Oil. When that job dried up, then I worked unloading bananas at the docks. Now, those bananas now come into Ventura or Oxnard, but in those days they came into the port of LA, and it was such hard work, even the longshoremen didn't want to do it. So they farmed it out to the laborers union. And they would pay you for 8 hours, but you only worked for 4, because you were on an hour, off an hour, because they gave you an hour to rest. That's literally how hard the work was. Now, after you'd done it a couple of weeks and you kind of, got used to it, you'd just work 4 hours and you'd go home. But the first couple of weeks I was there, my God, I thought they were going to kill me. I never worked so hard in my life. Hardest work I ever did, unloading banana boats. So anyway, but it fostered in me a desire that I don't want to do physical labor. I want to be behind a desk giving orders. I don't want to be not that I have any. I don't doesn't mean I don't appreciate honest toil because I do, but I just didn't want to do that kind of work my whole life. So anyway, so that was what I did immediately upon graduating. So I did that for a while, and then my brother-in-law got me a job working for the city and county of San Francisco. I was what they called a swamper on a truck. I was a helper to a teamster. And funny story, when my very first job, when I got hired out of the union hall, sent out to Union Oil. Of course, again, because my dad had connections, initially I got a pretty cush job. And that job was I went out with a teamster, and all I was to do was to go out and collect bets. That's all I did. And so this teamster, who was a member of the Hells Angels and the Chicago Outlaws, I'll take that back. I think he belonged just to the Chicago Outlaws. I think they were a rival group to the Hells Angels.
Mm-hmm.
And he was one tough cookie. And anyway, he and I would just go around the job. It was a huge job site. And we drove around in a truck. And he would drive. And then he'd say, here, go get $100 from Smitty over here, the electrician. So I'd go over and I'd say, hey, you got to pay up. And that's what we did all day, collect bets.
Wow.
And make and collect bets. And, you know, of course, I was pretty naive in those days. And I thought, this just can't be legal. Well, of course it wasn't legal, you know. But it was fully sanctioned by Fluor, the contractor. They knew what was going on, and here there were two salaries going to this enterprise. So I don't know. Somebody higher up the food chain was obviously getting a piece of that action, I'm sure. But that was kind of interesting. So.
And I know that you eventually got into real estate and in brokerage. So how did you end up getting into that?
Well, I joined Toastmasters when I was 19 years old. I was working at the bank at what was then called First Western Bank, which became Lloyd's Bank, which went on to become Sanwa and then Bank of the West, what today is known as Bank of the West. And while I was there, a fellow that I worked with, a guy who was our senior class he was one of our senior class officers, Rick Picaro. He convinced me to go to Toastmasters. Well, he dropped out and I stayed. And Toastmasters is one of the best things I ever did for myself. I mean, it probably, at the end of the day, did more for me than getting a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
The connections I made and what I learned out of Toastmasters was tremendous. It's helped me my whole life. Anyway, in that Toastmasters club, I met a fellow, Roger Dawson, who has become a lifelong friend, and he wound up going to work for the fellow that I work for today, who owned a fairly large real estate company at that time. And anyway, about a year or two later, a couple of years later, he convinced him to hire me, to have me work for him. So that was how I got in the real estate business. And what compelled me to do that was after I left the bank, I had a short stint selling safety equipment at the class, and then I wound up going to work for an advertising agency in sales, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed selling, and enjoyed the advertising business. It was very creative, appealed to my creative instincts, and but I got tired of chasing people for money, and what appealed to me about real estate was when escrow closes, you get paid. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You're done. When escrow closes,
Mm-hmm.
you're paid. So that appealed to me a great deal, and so that's how I actually got into the real estate business. But I worked with some very interesting people over the years. I continue to run across. When you're dealing with salespeople, that's a slice of life, I'll tell you. So.
And at what age did you get into real estate? About how old were you?
I was 22.
Toastmasters in itself has a very unique history.
What's that?
Toastmasters in itself has a very, very
Well, and Toastmasters has a very had its beginnings right here in Santa Ana.
Mm-hmm.
Toastmasters started in the basement of the old YMCA building by Dr. Ralph Smedley, and for years they had their world headquarters in Santa Ana up until about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. But anyway.
Well, now I kind of want to switch a little bit of gears. I got some nice background biographical information on you, Tim. I want to speak about the Santa Ana Historic Preservation Society and your involvement in the society. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we moved to Santa Ana from Irvine in 1987. I think it was July or August of 1987. And I didn't get involved in the Historical Society immediately. It was probably about 2 years after I moved here that I got, a year or two, I got involved. I met Diane Marsh, who was revered around town and considered Santa Ana's historian, although she now lives in Galena, Illinois. And many people refer to me now as a city historian, although that title really belongs to her, but she's not here to defend it. So, in any event, I became friendly with Diane Marsh. I wound up getting on the board of the society, I think it was in 1994, and it was right before the county declared bankruptcy. And Rob Richardson was the one who went to Diane Marsh, and the county was attempting to do some things which to attempt to save some of the people who would have been potentially harmed by the bankruptcy. One of them was the society, and he said, there's nobody on the board that understands real estate, and would you consider going on the board? And I said, well, okay. Well, I got on the board. I won't bore you with try not to bore you with a big long story, but it became immediately apparent that the society needed to go into a full public relations mode to save the Waffle House, because the Waffle House was then sitting on excess county land, and which was at risk of being liquidated because of the bankruptcy. And so the county had actually gone to the society and attempted to get them to transfer the asset to a Harbors, Beaches, and Parks asset, and the society was reluctant to do that, basically because they didn't understand the ramifications, that it wasn't going to hurt them. But anyway, that's what happened, and so it wound up getting thrown into as a general fund asset, which meant it had to be liquidated. So Diane Marsh and I began our own two-person PR campaign to convince the Board of Supervisors to save the Waffle House, because the church next door had made it very clear that they wanted that property to build a parking lot. And of course, that sadly, for many years, created a rift between the Historical Society and the Santa Ana First Presbyterian Church. and so they were a bidder for the property. And Diane and I convinced the city to bid for the property and to buy it. We put up $20,000. That the city acted as what's called a pass-through.
Mm-hmm.
So they bought it really to turn it over to us. So they bought it and immediately deeded it to us. We put up $20,000. The county wound up with I think the city must have bought it for cash is what I think happened. That's it. The city bought it. We put up $20,000 with the agreement that we would make payments, which nearly killed us. We made those payments for about 2 or 3 years.
Uh-huh.
And Diane and my plan was to convince the city council to essentially, once the bankruptcy was done, to say, look, you owe us millions of dollars. Tell you what, you just erase $140,000 worth of debt on the Waffle House for that lot, because the city owns the historical society owns the house.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just the dirt, and we'll just call it a day. I don't quite know what the city eventually did, because I know that there's still money being paid off through
Mm-hmm.
bankruptcy. But anyway, we were finally able to get a deal where we leased back the Waffle House from the city. They took over the mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
and we lease it for $1 a year for a 99-year term. So anyway, so that's how I got involved with the society, and I was on the board, on the ruling board up until about I think it was about 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and at that point within 1 year, as of the year that I resigned, I was vice president of the Historical Society. I was chairman of the board of the Heritage Museum,
Mm-hmm.
and I was president of my neighborhood association, and there was something else around town I was involved in, and it was just, I was on overload. It was too much. So,
Okay. I'm going to stop it right here.